Hey everybody, welcome to our video on using Microsoft Access VBA to retrieve user IDs. So there are times when it's useful to know who is logged in to your Access database. Perhaps you want to restrict access to certain features, either by username or maybe even a user group. Or perhaps you want to do some sort of activity logging or error logging, and in both cases it's usually useful to know who was performing the action at the time. So we're going to look at two methods to get user IDs from your operating system. Let's head over to a form I've built for this. You can see that this form is set to be the startup form for our database. I've got two text boxes on here, one for each of the methods that we're going to use to get our user ID. Okay, so let's head over to our code window, take a look at what we've got over here. Alright, so here is our form load event for the form startup. This is going to run after the form open event and before all the data is populated on the form. What I have in here is a call statement to get user data, and that is a user-defined method that I've got right here. And in here we have the two methods we're going to use to get user ID. Now I've shown this method in other videos. I'm going to set the first text box equal to using the environ function. I'm going to pass it a string called username. This is going to return the username from our operating system. The second text box I'm going to load by calling a function which I have in another module, get username API. Now this method uses a Win32 API, so I've got that loaded into a module. So this is the function declaration, or the function signature, if you will, that you'll pull from your Windows documentation. In my case, I'm pulling it from my trusty, very old Win32 book that I bought years and years ago. And so here is our function declaration from our Win32 documentation. Here is the name that we're going to use in our code when we call it. Library here is the DLL where the function resides. Alias is the name of the function inside that DLL. And then here are the two arguments. The first argument it takes is a string, and it's going to take a fixed length string, and it takes a long. The long tells us, or the long tells the function how long the string was you fed it. So here is the function we're going to use to call this Win32 API function. We're going to declare the string we're going to feed to it to be 255 bytes. The number we're going to feed to it over here in n size is going to be this guy, 255. Now this thing returns several things, several items of data. It returns a long result for its value. If it returns a 0, that's an error condition. If it returns a number greater than 0, it was successful in getting a user ID. Here is the name we're going to call it by. Okay, we've already covered that. Here's a string we just built up here, and here's the number that we're passing at 255. It's going to also return the user ID that it found in here, and it will return the length of that user ID in this value. So we can test all those things if we want to. So what we're going to call it then is after we call it, we're going to test this long result field. If it's greater than 0, we know we actually have a user ID. Now this up here, get username API, is a function. It returns a string. It's going to return the user ID. So if our long result is greater than 0, we're just going to return the user ID as the value for this function. We're going to return what's on the left of the user ID that it returned, the length -1, the length it told us -1. If we had an error condition, meaning the long result was 0, we're going to return a null string. Back over here then, we're going to set our second text box equal to that function call. And that's what we have here. It's already run, it's already executed when the form started up. In both cases it returns my username for this machine. I'm not on a network, I'm just at home on my machine. I will say, you might need to experiment a little bit. You know, if you're at work or on a large network, you might find the environ variable doesn't work for you. In that case, move on to the API and use it. I can also say that both of these work for me on a Windows network at a very large company. I'm pretty sure I remember the API version working for me on a Novell NetWare network years ago. So let's talk about putting your users into user groups. You can do that without a login form. Let's talk about a very simple table I've built to hold user IDs and user groups. Now, the first column here is an auto number we're using for the primary key. Second column holds the user ID, and the third column holds the user group. I've set this user group column to have restricted values right here in the table, and we're going to allow a value of admin or users, and when we display the table you'll have a drop down box to use there. I've got myself loaded in here as a member of the admin group, and the way we can work this is, let's take a look at our form here. Let me unhide this user group column, or this user group control, excuse me. Let's do that. Let's go to our code window. We're going to add our code to this form. Text user group equals a function called get user group text username A. And text username A is going to be the username that came from our API call. Okay. This function is over here in our code module. Get user group. What I want to do is talk about startup. You know, there is the shift key that when a database starts up, it can prevent your startup code from running. It can prevent a login form from coming up on the screen. If you have any code in there you want to run, say to get a user ID and equate that user ID to a user group, the shift key can prevent that code from running. So I'm going to make a suggestion here that now I'm not trying to build a super secure database here, but I am going to try to get around some of those things users might do to try to sabotage your code. That is, instead of relying on just the startup events of your database to get that user group and to get that user ID, you can make a function that operates such that whenever you need to use your user group for functionality or whatever, instead of just pulling whatever value you loaded at startup, call a function that can then test that variable that's holding that value. And if that variable is empty because they prevented code from running at startup, if it's empty, that code can go ahead and execute the code to get the user ID and the user group again, so that whenever you need to use that user group, if it's empty, it'll just go and get it anyway, so they can't prevent you from figuring out what user group they're in. Okay, that's what we've got in this function. Okay, so I've got a function here. I called it get user group. It's going to return a string. It's going to return the user group that the user's in, and it's going to use the Access 2007 and forward temp vars. These are global variables that do not lose their value when you have a runtime error. If you have public variables in a form, even a code module, and you hit a user and you hit a runtime error, often those things will lose their values. These temp vars do not lose their values, which is why I like to use them for like user groups and user IDs if I want to store things behind the scenes. Now, the way you set a value for temp var is this syntax right here. Temp vars, give it parentheses, quote, and the name of the variable you want to build, and close your quotes and your parentheses, dot value, and set it equal to the value that way. Now, there is an add method for temp vars. There's also, I think, a clear method. You don't need either one of those. Simply setting it like this will create the variable if it doesn't exist. And if you want to empty it out, you can just set it equal to a null string here, and that'll empty it. However, the one thing you do have to be careful of if you're going to use this method of creating it is, let's say your users did prevent the code from running at the beginning when they started the database by using the shift key. This variable wouldn't exist. If you tried to use the variable without testing it for its existence, then you'd get a runtime error. So the first thing I'm going to do in this function is test to see if my variable exists, and we do that by using the isNull function here. If it is null, or if it's empty, okay, we're going to say go and figure out what the user ID is. If it's not empty, we'll just go ahead and use the value that was already there. Okay, but if it's empty, we know that somehow they prevented this code from running, and we're going to run the code now to figure out who they are. So I've got a query here that's going to hit that username table we just looked at. Select user group from users where user ID equals, and this is user. Our function is going to take as input the user ID, okay, and that's where it is right there. It's a string, which is why I've got it enclosed in single quotes. We execute that query and load it into a record set using the current DB record open record set method. Feeding it our SQL we just built, and we're going to use a snapshot record set type. If record count is equal to 0, then we are not going to return anything. We're going to return an empty string. We couldn't get a user ID. If there's more than one record in here, then we're going to set that variable, our temp var, equal to the user group from our record set. And then after the if, we'll set our function equal to the temp var. Go back over here. There you go. So we're going to be feeding this thing the user ID we got from our API call. So we're going to close our database and let the form run at startup again. There we go. It's got me in the admin user group. I want to show you something interesting here that'll happen based on the way I've got this code written. It's not ideal, so we can change this. Let's say I put myself in the users group and close and click the refresh button. It didn't change my user group here. And you might feel like it should, and I feel like it should. We'd have to change the code to make that happen. Why is that happening? It's happening because when I click the refresh button, it calls get user data, and we execute our get user group function. The user group function isn't actually down here. It's only going to execute this query if this value, if this temp var is empty, the way I've got it coded. Let's comment out this if. Put a new if here and comment out this part of the if as well, the end if. Save. Look over our form, click refresh. See, we're going to execute that query every single time, and we'll get that new value. So under this method, we'll always execute this query. We'll always hit the database. So here we have a potential efficiency issue. You'll have to evaluate how many users you're going to have in your database, how many people you think will be hitting this function at a time. Do you want them all reading the database to get the user ID if they're going to have a lot of restricted functionality in your database? You might not want that. You might want to keep this if to only hit the database when that value is empty. So it's a trade-off. You have to decide. You expect to be changing people's user groups, during sessions and whatnot, or is this just a one-time thing that's going to happen when a person's set up initially and you don't have to worry about it anymore? So you just have to evaluate that. So let's take a look at using our newfound user group ability here. Let's add a little bit of code to our form. I'm going to add it to form load. I've got a button on the form here called command cmd admin, and I want that to only be visible to people in the admin group. So I've got an if here, if get user group, feeding it our user ID from our get username API. If our user group is equal to admin, then we'll enable that button. Otherwise, we're going to disable the button. In order to get this to run, I've got to reload that form. All right, so it's form startup. There we go. So I'm in the users group right now. You can see that admin button is disabled. Move myself to the admin group. Okay, close our table, refresh. Open the form again because that was in the form load. Now we see the admin button is enabled and clickable. Yeah. So this is one way to deal with restricting functionality for certain people or certain user groups. This is, if you have a small database, this will be okay. If you have a larger database, you might want a slightly different approach, because here you have to, you're testing for certain user IDs, certain user groups. You're testing only certain buttons or text boxes or wherever control it is you're worried about. Let's say you have a large database and you want to be able to enable or disable things a little more en masse. I have another option available to us. There's tons of options, but here's one I've used. Let's head over here to our design and our properties window. Here's our admin button, and over here I've loaded the word admin in our tag property for the control. Let's head over to our code. Let's comment out this, and instead let's loop through all the controls. Let's iterate through all the controls in the form. And so we'll have another dim statement up here. Hang on. There we go. So we're going to mention CTL as a control. For each control in the collection of controls in our form, we're going to test the control type, CTL.control type. And if it's an ACK command button, then we'll do this test. If the control tag is empty, we're going to say, if the control tag is empty, we're going to say this is not a button we're worried about security on. We're going to make sure it's enabled. If the tag is not empty, we're going to go into this if, and we're going to test the value of the tag and see if that tag value is equal to the user group of the current user. If it is equal, then we're going to say this button should be enabled, otherwise it should not be enabled. Alright, let's come back over here. Let's close our form and reopen it. Now I'm in the users group right now, so it's still there. Let's change my user group back to users. Close our form, reopen it. There we go. It's not enabled again. So this is one way. I had a one database once where we needed multiple levels of security. I think we ended up with I think it was 4 different levels of security. And what I did, instead of testing user groups like this, we had user groups, but instead of putting the user group name in the tag property, what we put was a number down here. So I equated each user group to a number. The lower security levels had numbers like 0 or 20. Then above that was a 40, above that was a 60, above that was a 80, and a 100. What we did then in our loops was those controls that had tags were controls that had restricted access, and if the number equating to your user group was greater than or equal to the number in the tag, we would show or enable or make it visible. And if the number for your user group was lower than the tag value, then we disabled the control. That's another method. There's one more quick thing I want to look at. A viewer was having difficulty with some code I had in an earlier video on my custom ribbon. I had some code in there that was making a button on the ribbon visible or not visible based on the user's name. I wanted to review that code one more time in this video in response to his question. So here is my public module that has the callbacks for a custom ribbon. This is the callback for making a button visible or not visible. And in here I'm testing the environ function, the username, and if it's Ray, I'm making this button visible. And if the username is not Ray, the button is not visible. I didn't get enough detail from him to know what he was having issues with. I would suggest if you're having issues and this code is not working, perhaps instead of using the environ, try the API version of getting the user ID. I also want to show that you can put the same user group code into this ribbon function, this callback function. Testing the user group here, and if it's equal to the tag value, show it or not show it. Or you could hard code if the user group is equal to admin, show it, not show it. All that should work here in this ribbon visible callback. In fact, I used that in that same database that had the number-based security values. So that's it for this video. In this video we covered 2 different methods of retrieving a user ID from your operating system and from your network. We also talked briefly about one way of implementing user groups. Beware of, if you have any code running at startup, you have some way of dealing with if the users are going to prevent that code from running by using the shift key. And one of the things we looked at for doing that is when you need a piece of information like a user group and you're worried about whether that code may have run at startup or not, call a function that can re-get, if you will, that piece of information for you if that code didn't run at the beginning. Now, if you really need to secure an Access database and prevent that shift key from running, there is a way to do that, and there are several other things you can do to secure a database a lot better than what we were doing in here. And that is a topic for a totally different video. There's quite a bit to be done there when you want to try to secure an Access database. As usual, I'll have a link to the code listing in the description below the video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you got something out of this.